We will be continuing our series looking at prophets from the New Testament. And this morning I'd like to turn our attention to Paul. Much has been written about Paul, and a whole series of sermons and books have been written, so I can't begin to cover all of his life and all of his theologies and teachings in the time we have this morning. But what I would like to do is give you a little bit of background about who he was, where he grew up, his family situation, his education. Then talk a little bit about his life and ministry. And finally, look at his role as a prophet and apostle in the early Christian church. So, of course, Paul was a Jew. But he was not a native of Judea or even of Galilee. Paul was born in Tarsus. How many people know where Tarsus is? Anybody? A few hands. Well, there are actually a couple of Tarsuses in the ancient world. And the Tarsus that we are talking about in Paul's life was found in what is today southern Turkey. It was located on a flat plain below, at the foothills of some mountains, very well watered. And the city of Tarsus was a very cosmopolitan town. It was a blend of Greeks and Orientals. When we say Oriental, not as in Asia, but in the ancient world, Asia, what is called today Turkey, was referred to as Asia at that time. And so the people living in Turkey, various groups and tribes, those people plus a mixture of Greeks, and a colony of Jews, and of course a few Romans. It was a very cosmopolitan city. Tarsus was also a university town. It had a rather famous university, and there were various groups of scholars from different schools of Greek thought who met and taught and studied there. And so it was also known as a university town. And Paul received a Greek education while growing up in Tarsus. Paul was probably from a rather either middle class or upper middle class family. His father was a leather worker, and Paul learned that trade. Like all Jews, he studied and learned the trade of his father in addition to his normal education and further career. And he would fall back on that work, working as a tent maker during his missionary journeys to help pay for his expenses. Paul's father had been given Roman citizenship. It is speculated that he received this as a reward for his services to the Roman government as a leather worker. The Roman army used leather for many, many different things. Tents, armor, saddles. And Paul's father probably provided this kind of service to the Roman government, contracts with them, and as part of their recognition of the work that he did for the Roman army, he received his citizenship. Now, citizenship in the Roman Empire was not given to everybody automatically, and later on in the life of Paul there were several instances where people were surprised that he was a Roman citizen. Today, if you're born in a country, you are normally a citizen of the country that you're born in. Not in all cases, but it's very common. So being born in the Roman Empire did not make you a Roman citizen. Citizenship was something that was given as a gift or recognition of service, or for people living in certain areas of Italy. People living and born in those areas were considered Roman citizens. So Paul inherited Roman citizenship from his father, probably because of his business that he did with the Roman government. As I mentioned, Paul received both a classical education in Greek and Latin and the various writers and scholars and philosophies of that day, and he also attended the Jewish schools and studied the scriptures and learned all the traditions and teachings of the Jews. And at a rather young age, he was probably sent to Jerusalem to study there at the rabbinical schools, and he studied under Gamaliel, who was the leading thinker in Judaism at that time. We don't know exactly how old Paul was when he went to Jerusalem. We first read about Paul at the time of the trial and the stoning of Stephen. And at that time he was still a young man. Shortly after that he joined the Sanhedrin. And to be a member of the Sanhedrin you had to be at least 30 years old. And so Paul was young but not so young as we think about. He was also probably married, because another requirement of the Sanhedrin was you had to be a married man. We don't know if he had any children, and we don't know anything about his wife. Some scholars think that he might have had to give up his family when he became a Christian. So, as I said, we first read about Paul at the time of the trial of Stephen. He was not directly involved in the prosecution of Stephen or in the trial itself, but it is noted that he was the one who was holding the cloaks and the robes of the men who executed Stephen, stoning him to death. Paul was there holding their robes and encouraging them and giving his support to the action that was taken. Paul was a very strong character of Paul was he was very on fire and very enthusiastic and zealous for the things that he believed to be true. And at the time of the stoning of Stephen, Paul was very zealous for protecting Judaism and the culture and way of life which he had known since he was a child. And he was probably a little bit at odds with his mentor, Gamaliel, because as we read in the book of Acts, at the trials of Peter and John, when they were brought before the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel had spoken in favor of these men, saying that if what they preached was from God, the Jews would not be able to overcome it, and if it was not, then it would just fall away. And so Gamaliel was a little more open or at least neutral towards the early Christians, where Paul took a very hard line. He saw Christianity as a threat to Judaism. Some believe that he might have actually been one of the Greeks, or not one of the Greeks, one of the people who had argued with Stephen in the Hellenistic Jewish synagogues where Stephen had worshipped. And Paul saw a threat that the other Jews did not. He saw that Christianity was offering something new, that it was something that would be very attractive to non-Jews, and he felt that it would draw away people from the truth and the understanding of the Scriptures that the Jews believed. And he viewed Christianity as a heresy. And so following the stoning of Stephen, Paul, who at that time was still going by his Jewish name of Saul, was a leader in the persecution. He led the arrest teams, he investigated, he searched, he was responsible even for the death, perhaps, of some of these early Christians in and around Jerusalem in Galilee. And in a very short time, the Christian church was forced to completely go underground. Most of the people were hiding. Many of the apostles fled Jerusalem. Only a few remained in the city, and those in hiding. And because Paul could not find anyone else to arrest, he applied for authority to leave Jerusalem and go to Damascus. It was reported there were Christians there, and he requested authority and letters of introduction from the Sanhedrin so that he could go to Damascus and continue his campaign, his crusade against Christians in Damascus. And of course, you know the story. On the road to Damascus, he had a vision. And in this vision, he saw Christ. and he recognized Christ as God, as the Lord. And, Christ was asking, why? Why are you persecuting me? And Paul was stunned by this revelation. And he fell from his horse in the bright light that shone from heaven. And the other people with him did not see or hear all of the things that he did. But they realized something had happened to him. And when they picked him up, he was blind. And so, in a rather somber mood, he and his companions went into Damascus. And for several days, Paul remained in solitude and in blindness. And finally, one of the Christians in Damascus received a vision or a dream. And in that dream, he was told to go and to meet with Paul. And so, very reluctantly, he did. I mean, how many of you would want to go and meet the chief persecutor of your group or religion? That would sound to be like a death sentence, right? Or at least imprisonment. This guy was the one who was rounding up, imprisoning people, and some of them had even been put to death. Go and see this guy. Go to his house where he is staying. And yet, this man Simon went and saw Paul, and prayed for him, and the blindness was removed. Cataracts fell from his eyes. And Paul was converted. He became a Christian. And of course, this created a great deal of consternation and confusion in the Jewish community. Paul had been expected to come and to drive out or wipe out the Christians, and instead he was the one standing up in the synagogues and arguing and debating with the Jewish leaders and rabbis and making fools of them. His knowledge of the Scripture, his powers of logic and rhetoric, he simply ran circles around them. And in a very short time, the Jews had decided that they had to put a stop to this, that he was simply too strong an influence against the Jewish way and drawing too many people to the new cult of Christianity. And so a plot was developed to capture him and put him to death. And of course, you remember the story. This was revealed to Paul, and so friends urged him to leave the city, and he was lowered over the wall at night, and he left Damascus. Now, sometimes people think that, well, Paul left Damascus and he went to Jerusalem. Well, that isn't exactly what happened. There was actually a period of about 3 years where Paul spent time in Damascus, and when he left, he did not go to Jerusalem. Instead, he went out into the desert of Arabia. We don't know how much time he spent in the deserts of Arabia. Now, when we think of Arabia today, we think of Arabs, because Arabia, the word Arab comes from that word. But at that time, when Paul was alive, there were many Jewish cities and villages in what is today Saudi Arabia. And those villages remained down to the time of Muhammad. During the unification of Arabia, the Jews were actually allies of Muhammad. And it was only once that he consolidated power that the Jews were driven out, because they would not completely conform to the Islamic beliefs and religion. And so at the time that Paul went into Arabia, there were Jewish villages and towns. And we don't know exactly where he went, but he did spend some time in Arabia. During that time, he studied the Scriptures, he reviewed his theology, his understanding in light of what he had discovered about Christ as the Messiah, and developed ideas that would be part of his preaching when he returned to preaching and his outreach. And so he went back to Damascus, and he did spend some time there before finally being called to Jerusalem. And after this 3-year period, he went to Jerusalem, and again, in Jerusalem, the leaders of the church were as scared and worried about meeting him as the people had been in Damascus. They weren't sure if this was some sort of a trick or plot. And but Paul was introduced to some of the leaders individually. He met with Peter, and he met with James, the brother of Christ, who was at that time really the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And after meeting with these two men, they were convinced that Paul had definitely been converted. And they introduced him to the community there as a whole. But again, the reaction to Paul in Jerusalem was very, very negative from the Jewish community. And the leaders of the Christian decided very quickly that he could not stay. It was simply too dangerous. And so after just a very brief time in Jerusalem, Paul was sent back to his hometown. And so he returned to Tarsus, and he spent about 10 years in his hometown. And at that time, he preached in Tarsus and in some of the surrounding villages and towns in Cilicia, which is, as I said, part of southern Turkey. And he spent 10 years there. We don't really know anything about what he did aside from that he spent that time there. And after about 10 years, Barnabas, who had actually introduced him to the disciples from Damascus, he went to Tarsus, and he got Paul. He said, "I need you. I'm starting some work, and I want you to be my partner." And so Paul and Barnabas began a period of time where they worked together as partners in evangelism. And first they went to Antioch. And in Antioch, Paul and Barnabas built up the church. And Antioch was the first city by which the Christians were called Christians. Before that, they were just like followers of the way or followers of the fisher people. They didn't have this name Christian until they were in Antioch. That's what they were referred to, and that became the name for this new religion of Christianity. And after spending some time in Antioch, Paul and Barnabas decided to make a missionary journey. Barnabas was originally from Cyprus, an island off of the coast of Syria. Antioch was one of the biggest cities in Syria. And so Paul and Barnabas and John Mark and I forget who else, Luke I think was with them, they went to Cyprus, and they toured around visiting different cities and towns, preaching and spreading the word there. They had a number of interesting encounters. They met the governor. They had an encounter with a fortune teller, a slave girl who was possessed, and Paul freed her of the demon, and that caused a little bit of concern. But the Roman governor, when they appeared before him and heard both sides, freed Paul from any responsibilities for what had happened. Following their time in Cyprus, they crossed the narrow strip of water between Cyprus and Turkey, and they did some evangelism in the areas of Cilicia, which was Paul's home region, and probably visiting some of the places Paul had visited earlier, and also southern, what was called southern Galatia, some cities and towns in southern Turkey. And following this journey, they came back to Jerusalem to report about the success of their missions. Now, the method that Paul used in his evangelism was he would always start at the synagogues. He and Barnabas would go to the synagogue. They would preach to the Jews, discuss with them about Christ as the Messiah. And if the Jews accepted, they would continue to preach there. But if they rejected, which often happened, if the Jews cast them out of the synagogue, then they would go and preach in the city to whoever wanted to come and listen. And so Paul's initial work was always with the Jewish community. He would always start there because they were familiar with the Scriptures. They knew the truth. And they had common ground to discuss the prophecies related to the Messiah. But if the Jews refused, then he moved to the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world. And so the Christian churches or communities that Paul developed were a blend. It was a mix of early Jewish converts and non-Jewish people who had heard and accepted the truth. Now, the Jews, or the Christians, had never really thought about themselves as separate from Judaism. They simply viewed themselves as a continuation. You know, we have all of our traditions and customs, and we are continuing this, but we accept Christ as the Messiah who is promised. And so the early Christian church, which was predominantly Jewish, they still continued to follow the customs and traditions of Judaism, including all of the ceremonial law and the restrictions related to that. And they continued to go to the temple and celebrate the Jewish holidays, such as Passover and all the other feasts. But for these Gentiles, these non-Jews who were becoming Christians, they were not interested in becoming Jews. They were drawn to the message of salvation, the message of repentance. You know, repent and be baptized. Change your life. That was something that they were drawn to, but they were not drawn to the idea of all of these ceremonial laws and restrictions that the Jews followed. And so, very quickly, controversy and tension developed between these two groups within the early Christian church. And Paul was one who looked at this situation with a very practical and also theological base. And his idea was very simple, that non-Jews who became Christians did not have to become Jews. They were Christians. As long as they followed the moral values and the principles set forward in Scripture, they could worship together. For Jews, they should continue to follow their beliefs and customs in order to maintain peace in their families and in their society. But if there was a problem, the Jews and non-Jews should not be forced to live the same way, aside from following the moral guidelines. And so this problem came to a head because of the numbers of Gentiles coming into the church. The church was quickly becoming more and more non-Jewish. And so there was a large council held in Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas went to this council and presented the arguments that Paul supported, that the Jews and non-Jewish Christians should not be expected to follow the same kinds of lifestyles. The Jews would continue to be Jews, and the non-Jews would follow the moral values found in the Scripture. So there was a big debate about this, and after much discussion, hearing how God had opened the Gentile world, the council decided that Paul's suggestion and Paul's approach was the correct one, that non-Jews who became Christians would not be required to follow all of the ceremonial law. They were to follow the Ten Commandments, the moral law, and they were not to eat meat offered to idols. Those were and use of blood. Those were the restrictions imposed upon the non-Jews. And yet, even though this decision was reached, this tension continued for the next 30 years in the early Christian church. There were Jewish Christians who refused to accept the idea that Gentiles did not have to become Jews. And so the Judaizer versus the Gentile conflict was a very strong theme in much of the writing that Paul did. And it was a source of conflict even between him and the Jewish community as a whole, which later led to his arrest and trial. Following this Jerusalem council, there was also a recognition that Paul was well suited, because of his upbringing and training and experience, to be the main apostle in charge of evangelizing the Gentile world. And shortly after that, Paul and Barnabas left on their second missionary journey, which included all of the area of what we call today Turkey. And from there, they also crossed over into Macedonia and into Greece. It was a very successful chain of evangelistic meetings. However, in almost every stop, the Jews very strongly opposed Paul. And in a number of places, he was either beaten, one place he was stoned. They did not like him. And the resistance came not from the pagan world. You know, sometimes people think, oh, the Romans, the pagans were the ones who were opposing Paul. But actually it was the Jews who were his enemies at each of these stops as he traveled around. After this journey, they made a third missionary journey in which they retraced their steps. They visited many of the churches that they had founded in the first journeys. They also visited Ephesus, which they had not gone to before, and some other areas of Turkey. Following the return from this third journey, Paul came back to Jerusalem, and as part of his, during that journey, Paul had actually made a Nazirite vow, which was that he would not cut his hair or use any product of the grape, as part of a sign of his dedication to God. And at the end of the Nazirite vow, the time that the vow ended, the person would cut their hair and take their hair to the temple and have the hair burned and also offer some sacrifices. And so when Paul got back to Jerusalem, again, the Judaizers made accusations against him. And part of his counter was, oh, well, I took this Nazirite vow, and I'm going to make sacrifices. And the Judaizers were appeased by that, and also asked that he provide the sacrifices for 3 other young men who had taken a similar vow. So Paul went to the temple with these men to present his offerings. And at that time, there were some Jews from Asia who saw him in the temple. And because Paul spent a lot of time with non-Jews, they thought that the men that Paul brought with him were Gentiles. And so a riot broke out in the temple as Paul was accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple grounds. Now, in the temple, there were actually several different courts. There was an outer court, the court of the Gentiles, where anybody could go. And then there was a very clear barrier, which was called the court of the women, which, again, any Jew could go to and the women could go to. And then there was the court of the men. So there were actually 3 courts that Jews could go, or people would go into when they worshipped in the temple. And for a non-Jew to cross that barrier into the outer Jewish court, the court of the women, that was an offense punishable by death. And that was clearly marked all the way around the perimeter in Aramaic, Latin, and in Greek. So it was clearly marked. If you crossed this border and you were not a Jew, you could be put to death. And so this is what these Hellenistic Jews accused Paul of taking Jews, or Greeks, into the inner court, and the riot started. And it got so violent that the Roman garrison had to come and break up the riot and take Paul into protective custody. Paul was allowed to preach to the crowd under guard, but they got so upset that finally the Romans had to take him away. Paul was brought before the Roman, well, he wasn't actually the governor at that time. He was the local commander. And this man listened to Paul and investigated, heard witnesses from the Jewish side, and he did not think that Paul had done anything wrong. It was some sort of religious uproar, and Paul actually twisted things to his advantage by saying, well, I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection, and that is why I'm being arrested, or being hounded by the Jews. And of course, this caused a great uproar because the Jews, there were two parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, and the Pharisees did. So when Paul claimed to be a Pharisee and preaching the resurrection, immediately some Jews supported him and some did not, and chaos. And the Roman governor, or the Roman commander, quickly realized this was a religious issue beyond his comprehension. And so he put Paul back into protective custody. A plot was laid by the Jews to assassinate Paul while he was in Roman custody. And this plot was discovered, and the news was brought to the Roman commander. And so secretly at night, Paul and a Roman escort was taken to Caesarea. Caesarea was actually the Roman capital for the province of Judea, and the governor was located there. And so Paul was delivered to the care of the governor in Caesarea. And Paul spent a total of about 5 years in prison in Caesarea. There were two governors, Festus and Felix, that heard Paul's case. And the governors realized that Paul was an innocent man, but they were wanting bribes to have him free. And Paul was not willing to pay those bribes. And so they kept him in custody to keep the Jews happy. And finally Paul appealed to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, any Roman citizen could have their case appealed to Caesar. Caesar was the highest judge in the Roman Empire, and any Roman citizen could make that request. And so when Paul made this request, it forced the governors to send him to Rome for trial. So Paul was sent to Rome. On the way, he suffered a shipwreck and rescued most of the prisoners, well, all the prisoners and the crew. No one died in the shipwreck, thanks to part of the actions of Paul. And on the island of Malta, where they spent that winter, Paul witnessed and preached to his prisoners and guards, and people recognized that he was an innocent man. Paul was taken on to Rome, and he did have his day in court in Rome. Now, there's some difference of opinion as to whether or not Paul actually was ever free. There are some scholars who believe Paul spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in Rome. However, there is evidence that that is not actually the case, that he did have his case appear before the emperor, and that he was set free. Paul, in other writings, indicates that he visited some other places. He talked about going to Spain. We don't know if he actually carried out all of these plans, but there was a period of a few years where Paul was out of prison. But in the last years of Nero's life, Christianity was blamed for the burning of Rome by Nero. And at that point, a wide-scale persecution and arrest of important Christians took place. And we believe at that point, Paul and Peter were both arrested. And shortly after that, Paul was executed. Being a Roman citizen, he was beheaded. He could not be crucified since he was a Roman, but he was put to death. And he died in Rome probably in 67 or 68 AD, in the last year of Nero's reign. So Paul had a mission of about 30 years as a missionary, apostle, and leader and founder of the early Christian church. Now, as far as Paul's role as a prophet, as we've talked about before, we don't often think about apostles as prophets. There is a bit of overlap between their work, but when we review the identifying characteristics of a prophet, Paul did match those characteristics, and he considered himself to be a prophet. And there are several references found in Acts where he talks about being in trance or in vision, or an angel appearing to him with messages. And in talking about gifts, he describes himself as having this gift of prophecy as well. He was someone who spoke to God, and of course he exhorted the body of Christ through his many letters to the churches that he founded. He encouraged others and directed others in the proper way of living. And what he said and what he shared was something that other people could understand. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 14, he discusses characteristics of true prophets, and a very common thing is people have to be able to understand the message. And other people have to also be able to testify to the truth of what is being said. Other people have to judge what they're saying and whether what they're saying is correct or not. And when he spoke, also talking about the gift of tongues, sometimes people were confusing the gift of tongues and the gift of prophecy. Paul made clear that these are two different things. A prophet is someone who is under control. Their message is something that is understood, and it has relevance to the people that are receiving it. And so when we review Paul's life and the work that he did, we can see quite clearly that he fell unto the category of prophet. Now, Paul was also the recipient of prophecies. Some prophets do not always receive messages directly for themselves. Sometimes messages are revealed to other people. And there are 2 or 3 occasions which we read about in Paul's life where messages were given to another prophet, which were then passed on to Paul. Paul received several warnings at different points in his life about proceeding on to Jerusalem, and prophecies were made about him being bound by these prophets and even losing his life. So God communicated through other prophets to Paul. He didn't always communicate directly to Paul about some issues and things. Well, this morning we've talked a little bit about Paul and his work and about his role as a prophet. And hopefully, in this very short summary, you've learned a few new things about him. Paul is one of my favorite writers. Half of the books of the New Testament are believed to have been written by Paul, 13 out of 27 scriptures. His style of writing is very rhetorical because of his background and training. So Paul can be sometimes difficult to understand, as Peter attested in his epistles. So when you read Paul's writings, be careful. Don't just read one verse or 2 verses. You often need to read the whole chapter, or even 2 or 3 chapters, to understand his argument. Because sometimes he talks for and against something. If you only read one part, you will not understand his true position on what he has to say. So in closing, I hope that you will enjoy the books of Paul and spend time with them. There are a lot of valuable lessons that we can use in our lives today as Christians. Thank you.
Amen to that.